Good evening. Interviewed by Wayne Flask, please welcome Irvine Welsh.
Whoa.
Mine works fine. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming over. Thanks to Irvine Welsh for being here. And thanks, obviously, to the National Book Council for making this possible. How you been?
I'm good, thank you, Wayne, yeah.
Shall we start?
Yep, let's do it.
Right. You paint a grim picture of Scotland, of Edinburgh, specifically in your novels. One scene that I remember particularly was in Skag Boys when Mark Renton joined his father at the Battle of Orgreave during the miners' strike. What was your upbringing like? Are your early novels a result of what Thatcherism meant for Scotland?
I don't know. I mean, I think that I think as a writer, just like a person, you're formed by your childhood and sort of youth and early adulthood. You know, from that's the kind of that's the experiences that make you what you are, really. So I think that a lot of my writing kind of reflects that experience of growing up in a community that was an industrial community, and then was basically the purpose, you know, all the factories, like the places where I lived. You had the factories and the docks. You had the Rob Culloden shipyard. You had the United Wire Works. You had the Parsons Peebles, Bruce's, Ferrante's, Electronics, and they all just shut down. Basically, all the manufacturing industry just shut down. So the part of the city that I lived in kind of became redundant. There was no purpose for it to be there, basically, because it was built around these factories and the docks. So I think that my experience was of that kind of community, and having a place where paid work was replaced by drugs was the main sort of is the mainstay of the activity of the area. So I think that, you know, yeah, you're very much, as a writer, you're very much trying to understand the experiences that you've been through and the experiences that your community's been going through.
Can you give us a brief description of what it felt like to be, Scottish under Thatcher's rule?
Well, I mean, I think the interesting thing was that they used to say about Scotland that it was like a kind of Eastern European communist state, but in the West, because it was like, apparently there was more public housing, council housing in Scotland than there was in most of the East European countries, you know. So we were in this union with England, which kind of was basically, you know, the Britain and the British Empire and the imperial adventure, which was founded on imperialism. It was founded on industry, and both those things kind of started to go, and Thatcherism, the welfare state, started to go. The great nationalised industries, coal and steel and rail, became privatised. So all these things that formed Britain as a post-war consensus, as a country, as a sort of entity, started to dissolve. And we were left in this position where there was a kind of branch economy of what was going on down south. It became, the country hasn't really been a kind of going concern. It hasn't really been able to develop its own economy within the union, and that's been the kind of the ongoing change through devolution and through the Scottish Parliament and through the confidence that the country's started to get to move towards independence. So it's been a big change in my lifetime, that whole movement.
Okay. You build, in your novels, you build a parallel universe, if you want to call it that. There are characters meeting each other, there's crossovers. How much of your characters is fiction?
I mean, obviously, I'm going to say they're all fiction because they are. You know, they're all kind of constructions and compositions. Every psychopath in Edinburgh thinks that they're the characters in the book, and they get very upset when they meet me in a pub. And some of the ones that even get even more upset are the ones that think they aren't in the book. You know, but the thing is about now, it's because I've got to the stage, I've been doing this for so long that it's like now I've got the sons and daughters of the psychopaths who think their parents are in the books, you know, and it's like, that's about my old man, eh? And I go, no, not quite, you know. So you do have that burden in a way, but it's also a good thing because it means that people are invested in it, you know. So I've been back at Edinburgh now for the first time. I mean, I spent lockdown at Edinburgh, and I've not spent a lot of time there over the last 15, 20 years. So to be back has been really interesting for me.
How has it changed?
It's treated me really well, like, you know, it always does. I think every time I write a book, I seem to trash the city. And I think somebody's going to ram a beer glass in my face one of these days, but everybody's really nice. You know, they want to buy me a drink and say, you're telling us it is. So I don't know if I am or not, but it's nice that people still seem to care. You know?
Your characters often make considerations about the modern world and capitalism. Sick Boy is one of them. Which of your characters would you say is the moral compass, and which is the closest to the way Irvine Welsh thinks or lives, maybe?
I think you go through phases where you feel more like one character than another one, and to an extent they've all got to be part of you because you're writing them all. You know, you're writing through, you're exploring different or alternative selves every time you write a character, and it's funny because you think that you don't often see it in yourself because we don't know, you know, when you think about it, none of us know anything about ourselves. So it's easier to look outside and talk about other people and look at how they behave. But you're a kind of mystery to yourself, you know, and that's maybe that's our whole life's work, is to kind of find ourselves basically in some ways. But the way I've always thought about it with fiction is that you never really get to that point. You're always moving away from yourself a little bit, I think, you know?
When you're
I wrote a book called The Sex Lives of Siamese Twins, and the two main characters, the two narrators, were two young American women, and I thought nobody's going to mistake me for these characters, and I gave it to my wife to read, who's American, my ex-wife, and she read through it, and she goes, "Oh my God, those two characters are more like you than any other character you've ever written." So you kind of think, well, you know, you change the age, you change the sex, you change the you change the occupations and all that, and you think you've changed. You think I can't possibly have it me in either of these characters, but she reckoned that it was an exact composite of these two characters.
And did you expect it to be challenging to write for your main characters to be women and they are speaking through you?
No, you don't really think about that. I think you don't really think about. I don't think about a character as really having like a sort of a race or a sexuality or a gender or whatever. I just kind of start to write the character, and I make up my mind that, you know, usually it's a guy because I'm usually writing about toxic masculinity and you know, the end of the division of labour, the end of capitalism, and the sort of the rootlessness of men. But sometimes I'm writing about women, and I just designate the characters is male or female, you know. So often I don't really know until I get into it, you know, how they're going to emerge.
Most of your characters, who are mostly men, they come from hardened working class communities. They're people who will usually not have much time for political correctness or identity politics. As a writer, how do you navigate when it comes to political correctness or identity politics? Is it harder to be relevant when everyone is more worried about how things are being said rather than what is being said?
Yeah, well, I don't really. I mean, I don't really navigate it at all. Which is like kind of, the publishers always kind of sweat about these things. And because I write for TV and film as well, even more so. I mean, I've got this, I've got a six-part kind of a six-part drama, like a kind of, it's like a sort of crime thriller drama, but it's very dark. And the BritBox, you know, the streaming platform, the people there would go like, oh, I don't know if we can get away with this. Or I said, well, why? I can do it in a book. You know, but they were very good about it. But we were going to put it on ITV, the network channel, simultaneously. And the BritBox people said, well, it's best that there's a paywall for a year or so. We'll leave it off ITV for a year because you're going to just get loads and loads of complaints. So that's the thing about writing for TV and film, is that there's this idea of an audience, which you don't really have when you write a book. You know, you just think, you basically write for yourself. I mean, writing a book's a very self-indulgent thing.
Have you ever thought about censoring yourself from writing something?
Not really, no. I mean, you kind of, you know, I think being a writer is a very strange thing, because writing fiction is a really strange thing, because I think you've got to do two things that are quite contradictory. You know, you've got to be enough of an egotist to believe that what you're writing is important and is worth other people are going to read it. It's going to be worth reading, but you've also got to get past yourself when you're creating characters and scenarios and storylines, because nobody wants to hear about you. Nobody really gives that much of a fuck about you. So you really want to get past yourself and free yourself up to create characters and stories.
Back to political correctness, would you say that this increased emphasis or attention on political correctness has also affected the modern left in Britain and Scotland, everywhere really, where you have pockets of working class voters shifting to the right? Is Brexit a reflection of these long ingrained inequalities?
I don't know. I mean, I think that there's like, if you look at what's happened in politics right across the world, and particularly if you look at it in the UK, you've always had kind of a sort of on the left and on the right, you've always had a very, particularly far left and far right, you've always had a prescriptive kind of view of society. You know, whether it's been the class war or kind of racial supremacy or some kind of genetic supremacy. You've had these absolute ideologies. I think what's happened is that through the whole Thatcher-Reagan thing and through the whole epoch of neoliberalism, you've had a radicalization of the centre, and now it's like the centre has this kind of crazy politics whereby somebody like Blair and Bush can condemn 500,000 people in Iraq to death on the basis of nothing and not be held to account by that. So you have a massive disillusionment of people right across the political spectrum, you know, working class people too. And you have a kind of, alongside the economic liberalism that benefits the super rich because it's basically licensed for them to exploit the world's resources and turn everybody's assets into debt, do that asset debt swap on us all through through all sorts of things, through kids' education, through old folks' care, through the housing market. We have, against that, they've almost, the very rich have given the kind of liberal bourgeoisie a social liberalism, a kind of, so whereby they can set something up that mirrors that kind of divisiveness, and the idea you have a hierarchy of suffering of different groups, and that it's all devoid, it's all divorced from class and from economic discrepancies and disparities. So it basically becomes a kind of a massive distraction, a massive pantomime, and part of the whole the social mirror of the economic forces that set people against each other. And these condescending sort of token leftish liberals are great for the ruling classes, because the working classes detest them because of their patronizing ways. So they actually take the heat off the real sort of the real ruling classes. And that's been the strength and the genius of neoliberalism. It's operated on that global level, and that capital does reign supreme, basically. There's no question about it now.
Is it also a language war between the liberals and the conservatives, in the sense that, for example, the right has appropriated the narrative of the elites? The elites are the problem, they're causing the problem. So now you have far-right organizations criticizing the elites. Is there a
I think the thing is, though, that it's like the criticism of the elites by the so-called far right doesn't really have any political substance to it. There's no actual challenge made to these elites, other than this sort of this racist idea that it's a bunch of Jews that are controlling the world, which is just a Hitlerian kind of thing again. But the idea that this kind of silly idea that somehow that if everything is national and the politics are all nationalist, that capital is going to take any notice of that. Capital is always going to be global. It's got all the mechanisms to be global. So it's not going to take any interest in what happens at a nation-state level. And basically beyond that, you have another false schism between globalism and nationalism, between global elites and national elites, but they're basically the very same elites. They're basically the politicians in all these countries, whether they're right-wing, far-right, or whether they're kind of sort of liberal democratic, they basically serve the same masters, and that's global capital. And I don't know if it actually can be any other way now.
Talk of capital, you seem to be very bothered by gentrification in your novels. Comes up frequently in your novels, comes up in your interviews. Is it nostalgia? Is it fear of growing old? Or is it the effect on the communities that bothers you the most?
I think it's just an observation about the places that I go to and the communities that I'm writing about, and everybody sees that kind of phenomenon that a lot of old industrial working class places become, artists move in, and then real estate people move in, and sort of more working people move out, prices rise. But against that, like where I come from in Leith, there's a ghettoization going on now as well. There's a lot of places that have been built that can't be filled, and it's they've become that part of the places become poorer. So there's all these different forces that are operating in our city, and you just have to you have to, as a writer, you have to try to reflect them in some way.
You're in your, if you don't mind me giving your age away, you're in your 60s now, and you're inevitably tied to train spotting, which was a creature of the 90s. We still lived in analog times then, and since then a lot has changed in our lives. Digital revolution has taken over. You get streaming music and film, instant book publishing, online dating, which you elaborate on in Dead Man's Trousers. Do you miss the old days? Is modern life rubbish?
No, because I don't remember much about them, basically, so there's can't really miss them that much. Actually, And I actually do prefer it now because I'm kind of more sentient and I sort of I can generally recall what's going on. I think you live a kind of. I think that they were much more artistically and creatively stimulating. I mean, I think that the 90s was like a requiem mass for British culture. It was when we got everything together and we packaged it off and sold it to the internet, sold it to the global, the whole global kind of concern. So I do miss being part of a vibrant culture, a vibrant street culture. Now culture is all on the internet, and it's a media culture, and it's kind of top down. You know, it's like it's not contested or argued. If you got two gangs of young thugs in one city back in the 80s, they would go if they went uptown and they see these red trainers in a store window. And the hardest guy in the group says, "Fucking red trainers, let's have these." And everybody goes, "Oh yeah, red trainers are cool." So they're all wearing red trainers, these guys from this part of town. The other guys from another part of town, the hardest guy says, "Fucking red trainers. Nobody wears fucking red trainers. Only a ponce would wear red trainers. Fuck it, we're getting white trainers." So they all wear white trainers. And then these two groups of guys meet up the town and they just fucking knock the shit out of each other. And then they get a bit older and they say, "Remember when we used to argue about trainers and all that?" And they have a laugh about it. Now, what happens now is that some fucking social media influencer, some kind of Beyonce type wannabe will say, "Oh, red trainers are so cool." And everybody, all the kids are too shit scared to say, "Oh, I'm not really that keen on red trainers." So they're all wearing red trainers. So something comes away from the streets, culture comes away from the streets, and it goes into this place online, and then it's just kind of transmitted as information rather than as something to be contested. So
Sort of digital conformism, you mean?
Yeah, so we're in this place now whereby things aren't really debated or discussed or contested. They're just handed down as a kind of fait accompli.
Trainspotting is a gritty commentary about drug use and social connotations for drug users. On a more personal level, was it hard to deal with the stigma of being a drug user? And how did your family and friends react to Trainspotting?
Oh, God. Well, my mum was very upset when she read it, obviously. She goes, You're washing all your dirty linen in public, son. This is terrible. What are people going to think of us and all that? I go, and it was great because I felt so uncomfortable. And I thought, this is how I should feel. As a writer, this is how I should feel. And you've always had, when you write a book and you read it back, you always get this feeling like, fuck, what have I done? My mum's going to read this. My girlfriend's going to read this. What are people going to think of me? So it's a great feeling. Without that feeling, I would be very uncomfortable if I didn't have that feeling of discomfort. I wouldn't trust the book at all. I would think, I'm shitting myself. I'm on the verge of social humiliation and ostracification, and nobody's going to speak to me ever again. Thank fuck. What a relief. What a relief.
It was the same with all your other books, I guess, where you're still hoping.
Yeah, you've got to have that feeling that, oh, fuck, you've done it. And you read one particular page, you think somebody's going to use this line out of context or use this paragraph out of context, and they're going to crucify me. And they usually do as well, And then you read it and you go, you don't actually care. You worry about what people might think, and then when they actually think about it, you actually don't give a fuck. It's a strange phenomenon.
What's the novel you enjoyed writing most from?
Sorry?
What's the novel you enjoyed writing most?
I think you all enjoy that. You enjoy writing them all. You've got to enjoy writing everything you write. Otherwise, there's no point in doing it. And The bit I enjoy most is when you get to type the end, you know, and it's done. You think, fuck, I've got all this space in my head. Now I can fill it up with more nonsense. But I think it's a relief to finish a novel. It's a really nice thing to work on. I mean, it's like the first draft of a novel is great because you just fire it out and it's a mess. It looks absolutely like shit, but it's great fun to create this piece of shit. The next part of it, when you actually try to make it look like a book, you know, all this stuff has got to have a beginning, middle, and end. That's a bit more, it can still be fun, but that's a bit more when you feel like you've got a proper job and you wish you hadn't done all that, you know. And then the third draft, when you're trying to get it as nice as you can, that's quite fun because you know that it's going to come together as a book, like, you know. So it's, I think that some novels are tougher to write than others, like Marabou Stork Nightmares and Filth. I found very difficult. I wrote them very quickly because I didn't like the narrators. You know, I thought these guys are pretty dodgy. You know, one was a kind of psychotic rapist. The other one was a sort of misogynistic kind of right-wing cop with kind of bad genital hygiene. So you don't want to spend all this time in the heads of these characters. You want to get the thing done quickly. But in some, they were challenging to write. But maybe fun's not the right term. But they were, you know, they were good things to write. But some are more enjoyable than others. You know, if I write a novel like A Decent Ride, which is just a comedic romp, that was just a joy to write. You know, there was nothing bad about writing that at all. Maybe the bit where he's having sex with his dead wife, and there's maggots coming out her mouth every time he's just fucking banging her. That might have been a bit difficult. But apart from that, like most of the bits are fine.
But you must have a favorite from your novels.
A favorite novel?
Yours, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've got maybe 2 or 3 that I'm really very, very proud of and pleased with. And I've got 2 or 3 that I'm not quite so keen on.
Give us the names.
I'm not going to tell you what they are, because when I say that, if I say like, novel so-and-so, I'm not really, it's not my favorite one. Everybody suddenly goes, I'm not going to buy that shit because he says it's crap. Yeah.
You've been asking people to steal your books, so...
Yeah, I mean, I love it when people steal the books. Don't let, you know, please feel free to steal my books from a shop because it means that they do it on a sale or return basis. So it means that if they don't sell, they can't send them back to the publisher. So I get the royalty if you steal. So I much prefer you to steal than buy, to be honest. Like, yeah.
In his last interview for Q magazine, Bobby Gillespie said that nobody escapes unscathed from drugs. Do you come out of drugs unscathed? How has your life changed since you've sobered up?
Well, I mean, I'm not mad keen on. I'm not mad keen on kind of this idea of sobering up or sobriety as a sort. I mean, I like it as a concept, and I have dry months and all that, but as I say, like, you know, that's me kind of like 200 days sober, you know, in 63 years, because it's spread out over 63 years, like, but I'm not, I kind of think that I can't go out and cane it and take loads of drugs and drink loads like I used to do all the time. I think when you start to get to about your late 40s, you realise that there's no way you can sustain that lifestyle, basically. And it's good because you don't want to keep doing the same things that you've always done. So now I don't really drink or take drugs unless it's a special occasion. But usually a festival, I'll kind of just go away for a few days and just take every kind of drug known to man and drink everything and feel like shit for a week after. But it's kind of done, you know. I've had a good time. I've caught up with all my pals and had a bit of a laugh now. I was at a wedding the other week there, one of my best pals up in Skye in Scotland, And I was just like, I thought, I'm just going to have a couple of glasses of wine. And I was watching everybody just falling around and snorting loads of coke in the toilets, and I thought, fuck that. I can't be arsed doing it. You know, I don't judge anybody else for doing it. I can't because I've done enough of it myself. But I just think, I want to get up and go for a walk in the hills and do some writing tomorrow. I don't want to be all like, yeah. And I find it very hard now as well. The older I get, I find it hard to get intoxicated. You know, I used to, now I just get tired, basically. And I feel like the hangover's kicking in before I've actually got the intoxication, you know. So when the intoxication goes down and the hangover goes up, and there's a kind of vector, a kind of place where these points meet, where you should just kind of cool it, basically, you know. So I've long passed that point, really.
Movie adaptations. You said you'd liked the way Trainspotting was adapted to a movie. The Guardian recently published a stash of behind-the-scenes material, and there was this letter from you, I think, to the screenwriter, where you said, you did a good job with the adaptation. I don't like the way Begbie speaks. It's sort of too safe, doesn't represent who he is, where he's coming from. It's like you wanted to preserve the authenticity of the character in the movie. When it came to Filth, and the main narrative, the main narrator, the tapeworm, was not in the movie, how did you react to that?
Yeah, I think we knew all along, like John Baird, the director, and myself, we knew that we didn't really have the money, you know, a British independent film, to do the tapeworm well. I mean, it's like when you see all these expensive prosthetics and you see all the CGI stuff, the computer-generated kind of stuff. I mean, it's like you can't. In Trainspotting, we had the animatronic baby, which now looks pretty shit, but it's kind of quite cool in its own sort of way, you know. But you wouldn't really be able to do that now, you know. So you would have to have something a bit more sophisticated, and we didn't really have the money to have a sophisticated tapeworm that was winding out through the kind of frames of the film, which we wanted to do. But we kind of relied on Jim Broadbent's acting, and for him as a psychiatrist, to portray this kind of almost kind of manic kind of sort of tapeworm type character without actually being a tapeworm. We had him dressed in rubber suits and all that for a bit, but it didn't really kind of work. It just looked a bit rubbish. So I think you have to play to your strengths. I mean, you can't really compete with Hollywood on CGI, so you have to get the acting and the performances as strong as possible.
What's next for you? What's in the pipeline?
Loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of things. I just finished a novel. I finished 2 novels during lockdown because there's nothing else to do. There's no excuse, like, you know. So just, as a writer, you're always looking for excuses to fuck off and annoy people at their jobs and all that, and take them out and sort of distract them, you know. So when you have to go on with your own work, there's nothing else to do. So I've got a book coming out next year, and I've got another one coming out the year after. In 2 weeks' time, we've got Crime, which is a 6-part series for BritBox that I talked about, and it's going to go worldwide because we're just selling all the territories to that now. I'm starting work on 2 shows in America and 2 shows over here. I'm doing a musical of Trainspotting in the West End with Phil McIntyre, who's the guy that did We Will Rock You and all these things. And we've written all original songs for it. Myself and my music partner, Steve, have written 12 original songs for the we didn't want to license the ones from the film. We wanted it to be something completely different, you know. So we've done that, and I've written the script for that. So we're starting to do rehearsals and cast that now. And I'm still doing my DJ, and I still kind of do the music stuff. I've done a few festivals since lockdown opened up. Doing a few more gigs. Got one back in my hometown 2 weeks' time, so I'm looking forward to that. And we've got our techno act that we do, a double act that we do. We've got a lot of gigs coming up for that for early next year, quite big gigs. So it's all good fun. I'm keeping myself as busy as I possibly can.
One final question. You're 63, you train, you box, you write, you do DJ sets. Don't you feel tired at all? When is it
I'm
do you think
knackered
is a
now.
good time to stop?
I'm knackered now. I actually do need my bed because I've been working on stuff all day today. I've been walking around Valletta, going into coffee shops and just then smashing out a chapter. And I've got all these Zoom calls tomorrow morning, so I'm thinking like I should have an early night and go to bed instead of getting drunk with all you guys, which is what I usually do in these kind of situations when I get away from home. Look at all these come hither. Come on. But yeah, I was in, a couple of weeks ago, I was in Poland and I thought, I'm not going to go out. And it was like, because Polish people, I don't know if anybody's ever been to Poland, but people walk around with just like, outside, they just look so miserable. And then when you get them indoors, they're just suddenly, whoa, come on, and I thought, fuck. The Poles have all transformed in front of my very eyes into these maniacs, and they're going to take me out. So I was just drinking shots of Polish vodka in this bar until the wee small hours, and I had to pour myself onto that plane. So, yeah, so that was, I said never again, and I mean never again until the next time.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming over. I have a book
Thank
signing
you guys, cheers.
session. And thank you all.
What did we...
Thank you.
Good evening. Please try not to crowd up. Please sit down. If you need to buy books, the books are here.